Ich schwöre bei Gott,
the Almighty and Omniscient,
dem Allmächtigen und Allwissenden,
that I will speak the pure truth.
dass ich die reine Wahrheit sage, dass ich nichts verschweigen und nichts hinzusetzen will.
Friedrich Paulus' name is forever tied to one of the greatest battles of the Second World War, the Battle of Stalingrad. Yet behind the title of general and the image of an obedient soldier stood a man who lived through moments of triumph, disaster, captivity, and eventually a quiet death in a Dresden hospital. His story begins in a small German town where Paulus was born on September 23, 1890. His father worked as a teacher, and his mother came from a simple farming background. Nothing in this modest beginning suggested that he would rise to command an army of more than 250,000 men during one of history's most brutal battles. As a boy, Paulus was quiet, polite, and known for his reserved personality. Unlike many children of his time, he was not adventurous or daring. Instead, he had a careful eye for detail and a tendency to follow rules closely. He dreamed at first of joining the German Navy, imagining a life on ships in the open sea. But his weak health and lack of family influence stopped him from entering that path. Instead, in 1910, he joined the army as an officer cadet in the 111th Infantry Regiment. Here, he discovered a world that valued order, drills, and discipline. And for a young man who liked structure, it felt like the right fit. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Paulus did not become a frontline hero known for bold charges or dramatic battles. Instead, he worked in staff positions, handling supplies, logistics, and organization. To outsiders, this seemed unremarkable, but in reality, wars cannot be fought without men like Paulus, who managed the endless details of movement, food, and weapons. He gained a reputation as reliable and calm under pressure, someone who could keep things running even in chaos. After the war ended, Germany was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. Its army reduced to only 100,000 men. Many officers were forced out, but Paulus managed to stay. He continued his slow, steady climb, avoiding politics during the troubled Weimar years. While other officers showed bold personalities or attached themselves to political movements, Paulus remained professional and cautious. His quiet approach may have seemed dull, but it kept him in good standing when Adolf Hitler came to power and began to rebuild the army. By the 1930s, Paulus had become known as a man of discipline, organization, and obedience. Unlike fiery generals who gave dramatic speeches or sought personal glory, he stayed in the background as a planner. He was the type of officer who could draw up detailed plans for the movement of divisions and make sure supplies reached the front. These qualities earned him respect among superiors, but they also revealed his limits. He was a follower, not a leader of vision. This pattern continued when Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and then launched its lightning campaigns across Europe. Paulus worked in high-level staff positions during the invasion of France in 1940, helping to coordinate one of Germany's most successful campaigns. He was not celebrated in the newspapers, but inside military circles, his careful planning was recognized. Soon, he became Deputy Chief of Staff for the army, placing him close to the highest commanders and eventually to Hitler himself. In 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the largest military operation in history, with millions of soldiers moving across vast distances. Paulus played an important role in the planning of this operation, mapping out the logistics required to advance deep into Soviet territory. At first, the Germans made rapid progress, capturing huge areas and millions of Soviet prisoners. But the deeper they went, the harder it became to supply the army. The quick victory Hitler promised never arrived and the fighting dragged on. By 1942, Paulus received his greatest test. He was promoted to general and placed in command of the Sixth Army, one of the most powerful units of the Wehrmacht, with hundreds of thousands of men. His mission was to capture the city of Stalingrad. Located on the Volga River and carrying the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, for Hitler, this was not only a strategic goal, but also a symbolic one. Taking the city would, he believed, crush Soviet morale. At first, the Sixth Army advanced successfully, moving deep into the city, but the battle soon turned into a nightmare. The Soviets resisted fiercely, and fighting took place street by street, house by house, even room by room. Factories, apartments, and rubble-strewn streets became battlegrounds. Paulus' men grew exhausted, and supplies became harder to deliver. The German flanks, held by weaker Romanian and Italian allies, were vulnerable. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack, known as Operation Uranus. They broke through the Axis flanks and encircled the entire Sixth Army. More than 250,000 German troops were trapped inside Stalingrad. At this moment, Paulus faced the most critical decision of his life. Many of his officers urged him to break out while it was still possible. Supplies were running out, and the situation grew desperate. But Hitler, sitting far from the front, ordered Paulus to hold Stalingrad at all costs. He promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the army by air, a promise that was impossible to keep. Still, Paulus obeyed. Weeks passed. Soldiers starved, froze in the bitter Russian winter, and ran out of ammunition. Frostbite and disease spread rapidly. The airlift failed, delivering only a fraction of what was needed. Generals under Paulus pressed him to act independently, to defy Hitler, and save what remained of the army. But Paulus, cautious and loyal, refused to go against direct orders. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was finished. Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German army, expecting him to commit suicide rather than surrender. But Paulus did not. On January 31, 1943, he surrendered to the Soviets, becoming the first German Field Marshal ever captured alive. For Hitler, this was a betrayal, but for Paulus, it was an act of survival. In captivity, he began to distance himself from the Nazi regime, joining the National Committee for a Free Germany, a group of German officers who urged their comrades to stop supporting Hitler. This marked a turning point in his life, and it set the stage for his later reputation and his final words before death. After Stalingrad, Friedrich Paulus lived as a prisoner of the Soviets. He spent years in captivity, reflecting on the disaster that had destroyed his army and changed the course of the war. Unlike some German officers who remained loyal to Hitler even in prison, Paulus openly spoke against the Nazi regime. He gave speeches and radio broadcasts urging German soldiers to stop fighting, saying that continued loyalty to Hitler would only lead to further destruction. This was a dramatic change from the obedient officer who had once followed orders without question. When the war ended, Paulus remained in the Soviet Union for several more years before finally being allowed to move to East Germany in the early 1950s. The communist government there presented him as a symbol of redemption. The general who had broken with Hitler and supported the cause of peace, he appeared at official events, gave interviews, and tried to present himself as someone who had recognized the truth too late but wanted to warn others. By the mid-1950s, Paulus' health was failing. Years of captivity, stress, and age had taken their toll. In 1957, he was admitted to a hospital in Dresden. There, weak and frail, he spent his last days reflecting on his life. Visitors and nurses remembered him as calm, thoughtful, and sometimes distant. His Catholic faith had always shaped his decisions, and one thing was clear: he had never considered suicide an option. When Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal, the expectation had been obvious. No Field Marshal should ever allow himself to be captured alive. But Paulus rejected that tradition. He valued life, even when defeat seemed certain. In his final days, he expressed what he had kept hidden for years. His last words were simple yet powerful. "I had no intention of shooting myself for that Bohemian corporal." With these words, Paulus made a cutting reference to Adolf Hitler, the man whose orders he had once followed so faithfully. It was both a confession and a final act of defiance. Paulus died in Dresden on February 1, 1957, the age of 66. His death sparked different reactions on both sides of divided Germany. In East Germany, he was celebrated as a man who had broken with Hitler, a figure who could be used as a symbol of anti-fascism. Officials organized a funeral that highlighted his rejection of Nazism, with wreaths, speeches, and photographs designed to present him as a hero who had turned against tyranny. In West Germany, however, the reaction was far colder. Many veterans of Stalingrad saw him as a failure who had obeyed Hitler too long and condemned his men to starvation and death. Some accused him of cowardice, for surrendering instead of saving his army through a breakout attempt. For them, his confession came too late to matter. Historians have debated his legacy ever since. Was Friedrich Paulus a tragic figure, a man trapped by his own sense of duty who realized too late that obedience to Hitler was a mistake? Or was he a symbol of the dangers of blind loyalty, an officer who followed orders even when it led to disaster? His final confession does not erase his role in Stalingrad, but it forces us to look at the human weakness behind the uniform. He was not a monster, but neither was he a hero. He was a man shaped by discipline, caution, and obedience, who only at the very end admitted that he had chosen wrong. His story is a warning about the cost of following orders without moral judgment. Today, Friedrich Paulus remains a divisive figure. His name cannot be separated from Stalingrad, the battle that turned the tide of the Second World War, but his final words rejecting Hitler and refusing to die for him still echo across history. They remind us that even the most disciplined soldier, trained to obey without question, can find clarity at the end. For some, his confession came too late to save his men. For others, it was at least a small act of truth after years of silence. In the end, Paulus' life and words tell us more than just the story of one man. They show us the danger of blind obedience, the tragedy of misplaced loyalty, and the painful truth that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on the battlefield, but within the conscience of a single human being. War has always been one of the darkest parts of human history. Whenever nations go to battle, it is not only weapons and strategies that decide the outcome, but also the choices made by the men in command. Some of these men are remembered as heroes, others as villains, and many as tragic figures who became trapped between loyalty, duty, and conscience. Among the countless names of the Second World War, one name stands out for the strange mix of loyalty and regret it carries: Friedrich Paulus. His life story is not one of glory or daring victories, but of slow decisions, careful obedience. It's finally a confession that revealed his inner conflict. His journey shows us how even the highest-ranking generals can become prisoners of their own choices, and how history often judges them not just by their victories, but by their failures to understand Paulus. We must first understand the world in which he lived. The early 20th century was a time of turbulence for Germany. The First World War had left the country humiliated and broken. Millions of lives were lost, the economy collapsed, and the Treaty of Versailles placed harsh restrictions on the nation's military strength. For young men who dreamed of serving in the army, the future seemed uncertain. The German army was cut down to only 100,000 soldiers, and many capable officers were pushed out. Yet for those who stayed, the army became more than just a career. It became a place of order and pride in a world that seemed chaotic and unstable. Friedrich Paulus grew up during this time, watching his country struggle, and like many others, he turned to military life as a way to find purpose. The rise of Adolf Hitler changed everything. In the 1930s, Hitler rebuilt the German military, ignoring the restrictions of Versailles and promising to restore Germany's honor. His speeches filled people with both hope and fear. For the army, it meant new opportunities for promotion, expansion, and action. Many officers welcomed the chance to serve in a growing, powerful military once again. But it also meant something darker. The army was no longer just a professional institution. It was tied to the goals and ambitions of one man. Officers like Paulus found themselves in a difficult position. Their training had taught them to obey orders, to put duty above personal feelings, and to serve their country without question. But now, those orders were coming directly from Hitler, whose decisions were often driven by ideology rather than sound strategy. This tension between duty and morality would define Paulus' life. Unlike other generals, he was not known for boldness or creativity. He was not the kind of man to argue with his superiors or challenge decisions. Instead, he was careful, cautious, and always respectful of authority. These qualities helped him rise through the ranks, but they also created a weakness. When faced with a leader like Hitler, demanding total loyalty and punishing any form of disobedience, Paulus was the kind of officer who would struggle to say no. The Second World War was filled with moments when generals had to make impossible choices. Should they follow orders that seemed doomed to fail, or should they take the risk of disobeying and possibly saving lives? For Paulus, this question became painfully real during the Battle of Stalingrad. It was one of the bloodiest battles in human history, a clash that turned entire neighborhoods into graveyards and left hundreds of thousands dead. And at the center of it was Paulus, the man chosen to command the German Sixth Army. But before we get to that battle and its consequences, it is important to remember that Paulus was not born a villain, nor was he naturally weak. He was, in many ways, a product of his time, shaped by the traditions of the German officer corps, by the values of obedience, and by the belief that a soldier's job is to carry out orders, not to question them. His life shows how dangerous this mindset can become when a flawed leader is in control. While some generals resisted Hitler or tried to bend his orders, Paulus followed them, even when they led to disaster. The story of Friedrich Paulus is more than just the story of one man. It is also the story of the German army's relationship with Hitler, the tragedy of blind obedience, and the struggle between. When we look back at history, it is easy to imagine battles and wars as lines on a map, arrows showing advances and numbers representing armies. But behind every arrow and number are human beings, generals who give orders, soldiers who carry them out, and civilians who suffer the consequences. The Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, was not just fought with tanks, planes, and rifles. It was also fought through decisions made in moments of fear, pride, and desperation. Sometimes those decisions led to victory, but often they led to tragedy. And perhaps no story captures this tragedy more than the story of Friedrich Paulus, the general who commanded the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Stalingrad was more than just a city. It became a symbol of struggle, of pride, and of survival. For the Soviet Union, it was the city that carried Stalin's name and represented the spirit of resistance. For Hitler, it was the city he believed he had to take in order to break Soviet morale. The battle that unfolded there was not only about strategy, it was about ego, power, and symbolism. In the middle of it all stood Friedrich Paulus, a man who was never meant to be a hero, yet whose decisions changed the fate of hundreds of thousands of lives. Paulus' story forces us to think about the meaning of leadership. What does it mean to be a leader in times of war? Is it about following orders, no matter the cost? Or is it about protecting the lives of the men under your command, even if it means defying those above you? For Paulus, this question was never simple. He had built his entire career on discipline and obedience, rising slowly but steadily through the ranks because he was careful, precise, and loyal. These qualities helped him succeed in the German army, but they also made him vulnerable when Hitler demanded absolute loyalty. Unlike some generals who challenged Hitler's decisions, Paulus rarely argued. His nature was to follow rather than to lead boldly, and at Stalingrad, this tendency became his downfall. What makes his life so haunting is not just the disaster of Stalingrad itself, but the silence that followed. For years, Paulus rarely spoke about his role, rarely explained his choices. He carried the weight of those months with him into captivity, into his later years, and into his failing health. Only at the end, when he was weak and near death, did he finally speak freely, offering a confession that revealed both bitterness and regret. His final words may not have saved the men who perished under his command, but they opened a window into his mind, showing us the human side of a man often judged only by his failures. This is why Friedrich Paulus' story matters even today. It is not just about one general or one battle, it is about the danger of blind loyalty, the cost of hesitation, and the tragic consequences of putting obedience above conscience. His life reminds us that history is not written only by the victors, but also by those who faltered, hesitated, and confessed too late.